So I want to start this talk about forgiveness off with two different narratives. The first one is about Chris Carrier. And when Chris Carrier was 10, he was abducted from his home in Central Florida. And he was taken by his abductor into a swamp. And he was repeatedly stabbed in the chest and then in the abdomen with an ice pick. And then after that, he was still alive, so his abductor pulled out a handgun and shot him through his temple and left him there in the swamp to die. And after laying there for a few hours, Chris managed to somehow wake up, and he was blind in one eye, but he managed to crawl and carry himself to the nearest highway where he was able to wave down a car that took him to a local hospital, and he miraculously survived all his injuries. Chris is now an adult, and a few years ago, a police officer came to him and told him that they had found his abductor, that his abductor was sick and he was in a hospital and that he would be dying in a few days. And the officer said, this is your chance. You can go confront him about what happened. We have the evidence that he's the one that did this and he's about to die, and now's your chance to go and confront him about what happened. So Chris, took the officer's advice and he went to the hospital and he confronted his abductor. But then after confronting him, he then continued to comfort him as he was dying, and he was in the hospital for, I think, a week or two before he died. And Chris spent those 2 weeks, with his abductor and told him that, he forgave him for what he did. And that even though he had tried to kill him, he wasn't going to hold that against him. And then the man could die in peace, and Chris could live the rest of his life knowing that he had forgiven this man. Another story, in more recent news, we've learned that Amanda Grace Blackburn, who was pregnant with a child, was recently murdered in her home. And her husband's name is Davey Blackburn, and he's a pastor here in Indiana. And over the past few weeks through the investigations, they've discovered who they think are the murderers. They've arrested 2 men who are going to be going on trial here rather soon. But Davey has come out and said that he has chosen to forgive the 2 men who killed his wife and his unborn child. And, a lot of people obviously were taken aback by that and asked him why. And he says that despite all of the anger and the rage that he has inside of him, and all the anger and the rage that his children have because they've lost their mother and they've lost their baby brother or sister, that every day he has to wake up and choose whether or not he's going to let that anger and rage control his life, or whether or not he wants to forgive. He says that's a decision that he has to wake up and make every single day, and that's something that he'll have to decide every morning for the rest of his life. But he says that if he's not going to forgive, then it's going to tear down his soul, and it's going to tear down the lives and the souls of the people in his family. And for that reason, every day he decides that he's going to wake up and forgive those men who killed his wife. And these 2 stories are admirable, not just because of how tragic they are. Obviously, they're more noteworthy because of how horrible the things that have happened. But any time when someone has to forgive, it's really seen as admirable, because it's never easy to forgive anybody, no matter what. And that's partly due to our culture, because our culture sees forgiveness or admitting a wrong as a sign of weakness. And that really comes from this competitive sense that we have in our culture. One philosopher, Friedrich Nietzsche, said that it's much easier for someone who has done wrong to ask for forgiveness and then accept that forgiveness than it is for someone who has been wronged to give forgiveness to someone. Because in his mind, and at least with the way our culture works, it's a lot easier for us not to forgive someone, because then we have something over that person, which gives us a competitive edge, and we have leverage over them. But Desmond Tutu from South Africa disagrees, and he says that our dignity can only be measured in the way that we treat others. And both of these people are right, but we need to focus on how we can make ourselves more like Tutu and how we can make ourselves more forgiving. So why is it so hard for us to forgive? In all cases, no matter how serious, whether your wife and your unborn child have been murdered or if someone has simply offended you, it's always hard to forgive because true forgiveness comes from a true confession, which comes from penitence, contrition, and sorrow for your wrongdoings. You have to sit down and confront what it is that you've done that's wrong. It requires that someone is willing to swallow his or her pride and say that what I did was wrong and I'm sorry for it. And then the other person has to sit there and swallow their pride and say, you know what, even though I know that what you did was wrong, I'm going to forgive you anyway. And this really goes beyond just how it makes us feel, but it really has effects on our health as well. Charlotte Van Oyen Whitvliet at Hope College asked some people to think of someone who had offended them and what it was that they had done wrong. Think of the person, think of what it was that they did, and while she had them think about that, she monitored their blood pressure and their heart rate, and then also how much sweat they were producing. And she noticed that when she had these people think about someone who had offended them, their blood pressure increased, their pulse got faster, and they began to sweat more. And these people also reported feelings of angriness, sadness, anxiousness, and they also felt like they were in less control of their bodies and their emotions. But she had those same people go back and do the same thing again, but instead of thinking about what was wrong, think of how they could empathize with the person that had wronged them. Try to come at the situation from their perspective. And when she had them do that, then their blood pressure went back to a normal level, their heart rate decreased, and they began to function, and they were calm again, and they were in control of their emotions. Everett L. Worthington Jr., who is a psychology professor at the Virginia Commonwealth University, has been studying the psychology and health of forgiveness for about 20 years now, since his mother was murdered in 1996. He did a similar experiment where he had 39 people who either rated their relationships as terrible or terrific, so you have these two extremes, come in, and he had them talk or think about their relationships. And what he did was he measured the amount of cortisol in their saliva. And if you don't know, cortisol is the hormone that is associated with stress. It allows your body, when it feels stressed, to access fat quickly in order to metabolize it to, address whatever is happening. It's that fight or flight response. And then once the stress is gone, it deposits it back where it can be easily accessed, which is around your waist. So with these people who had terrible relationships or who had been in a relationship that recently failed, he noticed that they had very high levels of cortisol in their saliva. And they were also much less likely to be willing to forgive what had happened, what had gone wrong in the relationship. They were more bitter. And when he asked them to recall specific things about their relationship, their cortisol levels would spike even more. And then he took the same thing for the people who said that their relationships were terrific, and he measured their cortisol levels, and theirs were, as you would expect, they were significantly lower. And that's not to say that there isn't stress in happy relationships, but these people had normal functioning levels of stress. Obviously, they still had problems in their relationship, but they were able to function because they had normal levels of cortisol and normal levels of stress. And they were also much more likely to forgive, which is how they were able to progress in this relationship and why they believed that their relationships were happy. Lauren Toussaint at Luther College did an experiment where he asked 1,500 Americans to fill out a survey about how much forgiveness they have in their lives, whether or not they've given that forgiveness or whether they believe that they've experienced that forgiveness from other people or whether or not God has given them that type of forgiveness. And through the surveys, what he noticed is that people who were 45 years and older, so middle-aged people and then elderly people, experienced much greater life satisfaction, and they also experienced much less distress symptoms such as nervousness, recklessness, and sadness. And these were all the people who felt that they had been more forgiving and who had been forgiven more in their lives. Whereas the younger people, those who were, in their youth or young adults, felt that they had not forgiven as much, or that they had not been forgiven. And we notice this correlation between these distress symptoms in the two. And it makes sense when you think about it, because we know that hostility and unforgiveness are associated with each other. When you don't want to forgive someone, you tend to feel hostile against that person. And we know that hostility, from other research, is a characteristic that is most commonly associated with type A personalities. And this one specific trait is what tends to be the most detrimental to a type A person's health. And it generally leads to a lot of health problems, especially heart disease and heart failure. Worthington did more research that would support this, that said that unforgiveness can compromise your immune system, and this is still more developing, but it interrupts hormone production that helps your body fight off infections and bacteria and periodontal diseases, and it also affects how your cells are able to fight infection. Joan Kermans and Paul van Lansch from the Netherlands, and then Carol Rusbold from the University of North Carolina have done some research about what it is that makes people willing to forgive. And they notice that people are more likely to forgive when they feel that they have trust between the person. If they don't trust that the other person is sincere, then they're not going to accept their apology. And if they don't feel like that person has made a sacrifice, then they're not going to accept that apology, because there's some desire to want some sort of retribution. So they had these people fill out questionnaires about their relationships, both past and present relationships, and those who didn't have sacrificial relationships were more likely to have conflict in their relationships, and they were also having more bad emotions when thinking about their relationships. And there was very little compromise in these, because neither party wanted to sacrifice, so then neither party got what they wanted, and they would just be upset and have negative feelings towards each other. And Worthington again confirms this with some of his research. He found that people with a high desire for revenge rather than forgiveness, who weren't willing to compromise, had lower relationship satisfaction. And people who were willing to forgive had a better quality relationships, and they were also more likely to be willing to make a commitment to that person. They were willing to pursue a relationship and compromise and be in this long time, because they were both willing to make sacrifices. Frank Fincham and Julie Hall from the University of Buffalo, and then Steve Beach from the University of Georgia, went back and reviewed 17 empirical studies that have been done in the past about forgiveness and relationships. And what they found is that people, when they've been hurt in relationships and who aren't willing to forgive, change the goals. And they noticed that these couples who, at the beginning of these studies, were loving and compassionate, after having been hurt, changed into competitive, and they began to keep score, and they were always wanting to get even. They had to make sure that they were both on the same playing field, that if one had been wrong, the other one had been wrong at the same level. And other couples compromised, turned into not being willing to lose an argument. But we see that people who are more forgiving generally have higher self-esteem, and for the most part they're in better moods and they have happier relationships. So then that begs the question, if happy people are simply more likely to forgive, or if those happy feelings come as a consequence of your forgiveness. So the way that they tried to study this is through teaching people who hadn't forgiven in the past to forgive, and to see how that affected their health. And one study that they did is they took men whose partners had recently aborted their babies and who felt that they had been wrong. They put them through 12 weekly 90-minute sessions on how to forgive. And what they noticed is that these men who had gone through this forgiveness process, through these sessions, at the end felt less anxiety, felt less anger, and they felt less grief compared to the control group, who they had left alone for the 12 weeks, whose feelings of grief and anger really hadn't changed much. Peter Woodruff and Tom Farrow, who are psychologists in Britain, evaluated 10 different people and had them evaluate the fairness of a certain situation. And they would go through different scenarios, and ask, okay, what was wrong and what should be done in retribution. And when that happened, they noticed that the people didn't think about empathy or forgiveness, and the reasonable part of the brain, the cortex, was lit up because they were monitoring their brain activity while this was happening. But when they asked the person to think of how to empathize with the perpetrator and how to forgive, then the limbic system, which is the emotional part of the brain, began to light up. So we see that this part of the brain isn't necessarily linked with reason, which is also why it can be so hard for us to forgive. Worthington also found that when people would receive forgiveness, in the same way that those who gave forgiveness would experience lower blood pressure, their pulse would slow, and they would sweat less, and then the frown muscles in their face would begin to relax. And they had more positive feelings. And then again, when people have more positive feelings, they're more likely to forgive. So when someone is forgiven, they have these positive feelings which help them then to forgive others. And it creates this cycle that allows everyone else to forgive and to be forgiven, and to create this cycle that's beneficial for everyone. But people who received a sincere apology, but also got restitution, saw the greatest increase in positive emotions and positive feeling. So then that is where we see a little bit of a gray area on whether or not we should forget everyone in every situation, and whether or not, there are some times when we can't look past what was wrong, and whether or not we should always be willing to forgive. So then we have to look at how it is that we can apologize, because simply saying I'm sorry isn't enough. Simply saying let bygones be bygones, or live and let live, isn't enough, because that's a blanket forgiveness. It's a blanket statement, and if you're not addressing the problem, then you don't really know what you're forgiving. This isn't like a Hakuna Matata type of situation where the past is behind you, because if we forget the past, then the past is doomed to repeat itself, and then you're just going to get hurt again. So in order for us to really be able to fix these issues and to truly be able to forgive and to move on in the future, you have to confront what was the problem. And that's what makes forgiveness so hard. A wronged person must be willing to forgive someone who wronged them, and someone who has done wrong must be humble enough to say that what they did was wrong. Guilt has negative effects on anyone who's Guilt has negative effects even when it goes unacknowledged. So if someone is feeling that guilt because they haven't been forgiven, although they might not acknowledge it, it still has negative effects throughout their lives. It's kind of like when someone falls down. If you're going to fall down, saying that you are sorry is saying, I've fallen down, but I'm not going to let myself stay down here. And then the person who says that I will forgive you is allowing that person to stand back up instead of keeping that person down. Not forgiving someone also causes self-hatred and self-contempt. So not only is the guilty person going to live with these negative effects, but the person who doesn't forgive is also going to live with self-hatred, whether or not these two things are acknowledged. And that's what makes, again, forgiveness so hard, is going and realizing that if we don't forgive, it's going to end up being worse for us in the long run. In order to do this, you really have to expose everything. And sometimes trying to forgive makes things worse if one party isn't willing to admit that they were wrong or isn't willing to forgive. Because in order to truly forgive, you have to unearth all the pain and the abuse and the truth and everything that has been hurtful about the whole situation. And sometimes that just makes things worse. But it's important because in order for us to have relationships, we have to be willing to forgive. Whether or not you want to admit it, eventually in every meaningful relationship that you have in your life, you are going to hurt someone. And you are going to have to apologize, or someone is going to hurt you and you are going to have to accept their apology in order to keep the relationship going. If one of you isn't willing to make that sacrifice, then you end up as one of the couples who ends up with a failed relationship, or someone who has a terrible relationship with more stress in your life, and we already see how negative that can be. But what also makes this difficult is that it takes time. Forgiveness takes time. It's not something that you can just decide that you do. In some of these studies, we see that the longer time people were given to think about forgiveness, the more forgiving they became, and then the less stress they experienced in their life, and the more their heart rate and blood pressure would decrease. And that applies in all our relationships. If someone has wronged you, you have to be willing to take the time to forgive them, but you also have to be willing to unearth all the pain. And that's where it can be difficult, because right now, I forget how I was going to end this. So no matter how hard it is to forgive someone, you have to be willing to do it in order to promote forgiveness and well-being as a society, and then also for your children and those around you. We have to start as parents and as coaches and as friends, as people who promote forgiveness and demonstrate forgiveness in order to promote health and well-being throughout our society.